In the last video, we ended up with President Lincoln being elected, and we looked at the different things that pushed the United States towards the Civil War. Things like the war with Mexico, and then the Compromise of 1850, the Gold Rush, Dred Scott decision, and we culminated all that with the election of Lincoln. And then once Lincoln got elected, by this time in 1860, the South really saw him, because Lincoln's position was, I don't want slavery to expand beyond the areas it already is into these newly acquired territories. The South really saw that as a threat. They saw that as, if he's against slavery now to expand, who's to say that he's not going to really push to not only not have it expand, but to take it away from the areas it's already established. So the South really saw Lincoln as a threat, and as a federal threat against their personal rights and their states' rights to have slavery. That was our vocabulary, and we'll look at that in class. But now we are at the point where the war is really starting. And Lincoln has won the election, and when he won the election, South Carolina was the first state to secede. And so what that means to secede is actually to leave the Union, to say we are no longer a part of this organism called the United States of America. We are pulling ourselves away from that. We are no longer members of that. And so secession is legal in the Constitution. And so, as many times happens all the time in human nature, one person or one state or one person initiates something and then others follow. So within probably a 4-week period, a lot of the states, about 5 of them, said we are going to join South Carolina and we are going to leave the Union of the United States. So that meant they were no longer under the authority of the United States federal government. And this is significant because outside of Charleston in South Carolina, there was a federal United States fort that was manned by Army members to help protect this portion of the United States. Well, now that South Carolina is no longer a part of the United States of America, South Carolina had its own army, and they said, you know, these troops that are now in this fort, Fort Sumter, are now illegally on our soil. So we have foreign troops on our soil. And so the Confederate states demanded, they said, you need to get out of Fort Sumter and you need to abandon it because it's now the property of South Carolina. We're no longer a member of the United States. So they saw this now as a Confederate fort. Well, of course, the federal government didn't see it that way, and even though they could secede, that wasn't really recognized. So the Confederate forces surrounded Fort Sumter, and they lit a barrage. And this went on and on and on, where they went and opened fire. It lasted about 36 hours. Finally, it was becoming so intense that the Union says, you know, we're going to lose all these soldiers if we don't evacuate. So they call for a ceasefire. They say we will evacuate. The fort is yours. So that happens. And as Lincoln understands that to save the lives of those soldiers, that had to be done, he thought, I need to set a precedent. I need to make a statement to say, no, we won't allow this. And so Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers from other states to come join the Army to put down the secession, to put down the rebellion in the South. And so once Lincoln put that out, it was like throwing down the gauntlet, and more states seceded from the Union. You can see here is South Carolina. They seceded in December. And then in January, we have 5 more states. You know, February 1st, you have Texas. And so within a few weeks' time, 5 weeks' time, 6 weeks' time, you have quite a few states saying, we're joining them. We're done. We're done with Lincoln and the government. And so then we add the rest of the states. In North Carolina, interestingly, our state was the last one to secede. And so one thing you need to notice here, on this map, you will see the green are the slave states that seceded, that left the Union. Not all states that allowed slavery left the Union. There were 3 that sided with the North. They agreed they did not want to leave the Union, and that was Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. And so those were the states that were slave states but fought on the side of the North. Now there was one state about halfway within the confines of the war in 1863 who sided with the North and became its own state, and it is West Virginia. And just a side note, the 50 westernmost counties in Virginia were opposed to slavery. And these are the areas in Virginia that is mostly the Appalachian Mountains. So farming and agriculture was not the norm there. But in the other part of Virginia, very much, there were tobacco farmers. So the West Virginia, those counties seceded from Virginia and created their own state, today we know as West Virginia. So this whole idea of secession and leaving, this is kind of going through, it's being applied to a lot of different situations. Now that we've declared war, each side has their own advantages. Each side has their own strengths. Now the Southern advantage is that they were fighting for their soil, and they were fighting mostly on their soil. And so they knew the territory. They were fighting for their homes, their way of life, their property. And so when you're fighting for yours, you will respond and fight much more ferociously than if you're fighting over in a place that doesn't really belong to you. And the South also, besides fighting for their homeland, they also had the most experienced military, soldiers and officers. And as we go through this, you'll see how significant that was. So the South really had the passion on their side, the knowledge of the fighting landscape. They knew where to hide, they knew where to ambush. And they also had the officers with the most experience who understood fighting tactics and how to apply them. The Northern advantages were different, but they were still just as significant. The North had 110 out of 130,000 factories. Total in the United States, the North had the majority of them. They're the ones who could produce and provide the supplies and the uniforms and the bullets and everything that an army needed. Not only did they have the factories, but they had twice as much railroad track. So the factories could produce what the army needed and ship it and move it to where the army was at much more efficiently and effectively. It had a much larger population, a greater pool to pull from. And so they could have many more soldiers. Well, you may have the passion on one side, but passion doesn't always overcome numbers. So having the numbers could be quite significant. 2/3 of the nation lived in the states that remained in the Union. The majority of the population was in the North. And so politically and ideologically, they would side with the North. And 1/3 of the South's population, total population, were slaves who did not have any civil rights, who did not have any freedoms. So even though the South may have had a certain number of people, 1/3 of those people were not going to fight on the side of the North or the South, on the side of the South. So take time, and as you are taking your notes, really understand what the advantages both sides had. Now, here in the North, you could say maybe they didn't have the passion, weren't fighting for their land. They may have a lot of soldiers, but not good officers. In the South, they could have the passion, they could have the knowledge, but not the tools or the supplies needed to accomplish what they needed to accomplish. So in the next video, we'll look at how the war was fought out within the confines of these strengths and weaknesses.